Yes, good morning, dear students. So now that we have talked about the male reproductive system, we go into the counterpart, the female reproductive system. What are the parts of the female reproductive system? So, in the males, you have the male gonad called as the testis. In the female, you have the female gonad called as the ovary, which produces an egg. And this egg, released from the ovary, now goes into two tubes, which are called as the fallopian tubes, also called as oviducts. And from the oviducts arise the main organ, which is called as the uterus. The uterus opens to the outside by an opening called as the vagina. And then we have the external view of the female genital organ. The lady is sleeping and you are seeing everything from outside. Whatever is visible from outside, which is called as the external genitalia of the female, and that is called as the vulva. So what you see from outside is called as the vulva. Then we have associated glands. In males, we had glands which produce semen. In females, you have similar glands called as the vestibular or Bartholin's gland. And then we have paraurethral glands of skin and the breast or the mammary glands. So which are the glands that are vestibular or Bartholin's glands, paraurethral glands of skin, and the breast or the mammary glands. Let's start with these organs. So, सबसे पहले you have the ovaries. The ovaries are the female gonads situated inside the abdominal cavity, one on either side of the uterus. यूट्रस के दोनों साइड होते हैं आपकी ओवरीज. ओवरीज are on either side of the uterus. The ovaries are attached to the abdominal walls by ligaments. And we'll talk about that. Ovaries are grayish pink, oval or almond shaped, and about 3 centimeters in length, 2 centimeters in width, and 1 centimeter in thickness. 3 by 2 by 1 centimeters in dimensions. Now, sir, here, look carefully. Ovaries are not attached to the female reproductive system. The ovaries are suspended in their positions. So if you remember, testes were also suspended above by the spermatic cord and below by threads called as the gubernaculum. And the spermatic cord, we remember, was an extension of the peritoneum. Similarly, the entire female reproductive system is supported by peritoneum. Peritoneal support hota hai. So here we have the diaphragm, and from the diaphragm arise membranes called as the peritoneum, and peritoneum supports the uterus. Uterus को support करता है, and that support of the uterus is called as the mesometrium, also called as the broad ligament. So peritoneum supports the uterus with mesometrium or the broad ligament. Peritoneum also supports the fallopian tube in its position by a covering called mesosalpinx. Mesosalpinx. And then the peritoneum supports the ovary, and ovary के लिए 3 peritoneal supports हो जाते हैं. From the ovary, peritoneum attaches it to the uterus by a ligament called as the ovarian ligament. Ovarian ligament is attaching ovary to the uterus, and from the ovary to the side walls, to the side wall, it is having a ligament called as the suspensory ligament. Suspensory ligament. And to the back wall, dorsal wall, by a fold called as the mesovarium. Mesovarium. So once again, ovary is attached to the uterus by ovarian ligament, to the side wall by suspensory ligament, and to the back side by mesovarium. It is through this mesovarium that ovary gets blood vessels and nerves. So blood vessels and nourishment mesovarium से मिलता है ovary को. So I hope you all have understood this. Here we have diaphragm, from which arises peritoneum. Peritoneum covers the uterus to form the mesometrium or the broad ligament, supports the fallopian tube by forming mesosalpinx, and supports the ovary by forming ovarian ligament and suspensory ligament, and backside mesovarium, through which blood vessels and nerves enter into the ovary. What are the functions of the ovary? Ovary produces female gamete called as the ovum or the egg, and ovary produces 2 female sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen and progesterone, 2 female sex hormones which are steroid hormones. Now, other hormones insulin, glucagon, growth hormone are chemically proteins, but sex hormones, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, are chemically lipids. They are made of fats, cholesterol, and are called as steroid hormones. तो estrogen, progesterone, testosterone lipid hormones होते हैं called as steroid hormones. That's the ovary. And then we have the fallopian tubes or the oviducts. The fallopian tubes extend laterally away from the midline, from the uterus to near each ovary. The fallopian tubes extend laterally from the uterus till near each ovary. Each fallopian tube is about 10 to 12 centimeters long, very muscular, and has in it, ध्यान से सुनना, lots of finger-like projections at its tip, which are called as fimbriae. And when the ovary releases the egg, it is these fimbriae that move and suck the egg into a big dilated part, which is called as the infundibulum. Infundibulum में egg जाता है through an opening called as the ostium. तो समझो ये है fimbriae, and they move and suck the egg into a small opening called ostium, and ostium opens into this big dilated part which is called as the infundibulum. The entire fallopian tube has delicate finger-like processes which are called as cilia. You remember, Vasa efferentia had ciliary cells. Similarly, the fallopian tube also has cilia, and the egg sucked into the infundibulum starts passing through cilia, and ciliary movement से आगे जाता है into a broad dilated part which is called as the ampulla, and ampulla opens into a narrow part which is called as the isthmus, and isthmus opens into a small segment called as the intrauterine segment. ये uterus के अंदर है, intrauterine segment. And so what will happen? So if you remember, the egg is sucked into the fallopian tube. Now, if the egg starts moving with the help of cilia, the egg is in the ampulla, and more specifically at the junction of the ampulla and the isthmus. And if at that time copulation takes place, ejaculation takes place, sperms by their zigzag movement will enter into the fallopian tube and fertilization takes place in the ampulla, or more specifically at the junction of the ampulla and the isthmus. And a zygote is formed at the ampullary isthmic junction. This zygote will now start undergoing cell division, if you remember, to form a 16 cell structure called as a morula. And morula moves with the help of cilia and drops into the uterus. So the egg was released. Who sucks the egg? Fimbriae. Where does the egg open into the opening called ostium? Into which part it goes? Infundibulum. Then by ciliary action, where does the egg enter into the ampulla? From the ampulla, where does it go into the isthmus? Where does fertilization take place? In the ampulla. To be more specific, at the ampullary isthmic junction. And where does zygote eventually pass? Through the isthmus with the help of cilia, and zygote keeps on dividing, forms a morula, and then drops into the uterus. So this was your fallopian tube. Then we have the uterus or the womb. The uterus lies in the abdominal cavity behind the urinary bladder and in front of the rectum. So if you see this carefully, so ये है आपका cut section of the female body. Here we have uterus and vagina. Here we have urinary bladder and urethra. And here we have rectum and anus. So, ये है urinary bladder, urethra, urine passes here. We have rectum and anus, stools, fecal matter passes here. And here in between the excretory system and digestive system, we have the reproductive system. So, uterus, vagina, beach mein hai. And where is the uterus present? Just behind the urinary bladder and in front of the rectum. The uterus is hollow, empty inside, pear shape, shaped like a pear fruit, like an electric bulb, broad above and narrow below. It is very muscular and very, very distensible. It has a phenomenal capacity to stretch. So, a normal uterus is about 3 inches long, 2 inches broad, and 1 inch in thickness. And during pregnancy, it will stretch to 2 feet by 1.5 feet by 1.5 feet. There is a 54 centimeter baby inside. And imagine the uterus has stretched so much. It is because the uterus is highly muscular. And it is, if you remember, it is supported by peritoneum called mesometrium or the broad ligament. ये हमने किया था अभी. Who supports the uterus? The mesometrium or the broad ligament. And so the uterus is divided into three parts. तो सर यूट्रस को अगर देखें उसमें तीन पार्ट्स होते हैं. The upper is a dome shaped part called as the fundus, which is the above of the opening of the fallopian tube. Fallopian tubes के ऊपर होता है fundus. The middle is a tapering part called as the body of the uterus. ये है body of the uterus. And below we have a narrow part which is called as the cervix of the uterus. So we have fundus, we have body, and we have cervix. So three parts, of which the junction of the body and the cervix is a narrow part called as the isthmus. Any narrowing is called isthmus. If you remember, fallopian tube में भी जो narrow part था उसे isthmus कहते हैं. Similarly, यहाँ body of the uterus is joining the narrow part called cervix. तो ये एक narrow area है called the isthmus. The cervix opens into the vagina. Cervix vagina में open होता है. And the cervix has a canal called as the cervical canal. And cervical canal बीच में broad होता है, ऊपर और नीचे narrow होता है. And that small narrow opening above is called as the internal os. And a small narrow opening here is called as the external os. So you have internal os and external os, बीच में cervical canal होती है. And a cut section of the uterus shows the uterus is made up of three layers, namely perimetrium, myometrium, and endometrium. तो ये यूट्रस की तीन लेयर है. सबसे बाहर होती है a sticky serous layer, which is called as perimetrium, sticky layer. The middle is a very muscular layer called as the myometrium. And inside is a layer full of blood vessels, uterine glands, and mucus glands. Blood vessels होते हैं, uterine glands होते हैं, and mucus glands होते हैं. And that layer is called as the endometrium. Sir, why these specific layers? The perimetrium is sticky and serous. it will allow the uterus to expand without any friction. So pregnancy में जब uterus बड़ा होगा, it will come in contact with all the other organs of the abdominal cavity. तो यूट्रस और दूसरे ऑर्गन्स के बीच में फ्रिक्शन हो सकता है. Who will prevent that friction? The sticky layer called as the perimetrium. And then we have the middle layer called myometrium. It is muscular and it will allow the uterus to tremendously expand throughout pregnancy. And 9 months later, the same myometrium contracts. And myometrium के contraction से the baby gets delivered through the vagina and parturition or childbirth takes place due to the contraction of the myometrium. And we have that inner delicate lining called the endometrium. Suppose ovulation takes place and the egg is in the fallopian tube. If at the same time copulation takes place, ejaculation takes place, and sperms are released in the vagina, and sperms now enter the fallopian tube and fuse with the egg to form the zygote. The zygote moves forward with the help of cilia to form the morula, and morula drops on the uterus. Morula drops on the endometrium, and morula sticks on the endometrium because of mucus. And the endometrium has in it many glands called uterine glands. Uterine glands give out milk, a sugary fluid called as uterine milk. And uterine milk enters the morula and supplies it with further nourishment to now become a blastula. And morula से blastula बन जाता है fluid filled with the help of uterine milk. And then the blastula starts forming finger-like projections which are called as chorionic villi. And chorionic villi now bury into the endometrium. And you remember endometrium has in it blood vessels. And chorionic villi come in contact with blood vessels and start absorbing nourishment from it. And in the future, this point of contact with chorionic villi becomes a big bag-like structure called as the placenta. And placenta से arise होता है umbilical cord, which is attached to the fetus inside. And umbilical cord से fetus की blood capillaries placenta के अंदर जाती है and mother की blood capillaries now come in contact, and from the mother's blood oxygen, sugar, nourishment, enzymes, vitamins, hormones all enter into the fetus. So who's the connecting link between the mother and the fetus? This bag called as the placenta and the umbilical cord. This placenta is attached to your endometrium. Now, this is if ovulation takes place and fertilization takes place. But suppose ovulation takes place and the egg does not get fertilized. समझो copulation नहीं हुआ है. Now the unfertilized egg will drop in the endometrium. Will the unfertilized egg stick to the endometrium and form a zygote? No. As a matter of fact, as soon as the unfertilized egg drops on the endometrium, the endometrium bursts. Blood vessels burst. Uterine glands burst. And mucus glands burst. Blood, mucus, uterine milk, and the unfertilized egg come out from the uterus through the vagina out of the human body, and that phenomenon is called as menstruation. You all have heard of it. Once girls reach puberty, bleeding or menstrual cycle begins. The menstrual cycle, we'll talk at length about it, is due to the rupturing of the endometrium because the egg did not get fertilized. So that is your uterus. Then we have the vagina. The vagina is a tube extending from the cervix to the vestibule. तो सर ये आपका uterus है and ये आपका vagina. Vagina extends from the cervix to the vestibule, to the outside, called as the vestibule. तो ये vestibule है सर. ये आपके front muscles है, ये आपके back muscles है, and vagina, urethra, rectum anus, all open into a muscle, and that muscle is called as the vestibule. तो उसे vestibule कहते हैं. The vagina is 7 to 9 centimeters long, highly distensible, very muscular. It can stretch a lot. And cervix opens in the vagina. The wall is muscular and lined by mucous membrane. Vagina में बहुत mucus होता है. When the penis is put in the vagina, lubrication is provided by mucus for a smooth sexual intercourse. it is directed upwards and backwards. Vagina ऐसे ऊपर और पीछे जाता है. It's up and back. And you have the inner cells of the vagina stored glycogen. तो vagina में ना बहुत सारा glycogen stored होता है. And in the vagina are found lactic acid bacteria. And lactic acid bacteria will act on glycogen produced by these glands and convert glycogen into lactic acid. And lactic acid, we remember, will make the vagina highly acidic and protect the vagina from fungal infections from taking place. And you have, so the lower end of the vagina is partly covered by a thin layer of vascularized mucous membrane called the hymen. So, vagina का जो opening है to the outside, vagina का जो opening है to the outside is covered by a vascularized membrane, a membrane full of blood vessels, and it incompletely covers the vagina. समझो ये vagina है, ये hymen ऐसे होता है, and बीच में spaces होती है यहाँ, an incomplete covering, and full of blood capillaries. This hymen is supposed to be protective. उसमें blood capillaries है, तो अगर कोई माइक्रो ऑर्गेनिजम्स अंदर जाएंगे वजाइना में, ब्लड कैपिलरीज में से WBCs आएंगे and it will kill the microorganism at the opening of the vagina itself. But sir, this hymen is at the opening, and when the penis is inserted inside the hymen during the first sexual intercourse, the erected penis will rupture the hymen. And hymen, we remember, is highly vascularized, full of blood capillaries. So the hymen will rupture and bleeding will take place during the first sexual intercourse. Of course, the hymen sometimes may not rupture during a sexual intercourse. Hymen, तो यहां पर याद है penis समझो यहां से चला गया, hymen side में displace हो जाएगा, hymen side में चला जाएगा and may not rupture. And sometimes hymen ruptures even before a sexual intercourse. Say a lady is doing gymnastics, or she's doing cycling, heavy cycling, or gymnastics, or horse riding. So a lot of pressure comes on the vagina, and the hymen may rupture even before a sexual intercourse takes place. So here we talked about everything. We have a nice concept over here. So do you remember, this is the cervix, and here we have the internal os, and here we have the external os, and बीच में है cervical canal. Now what will happen during childbirth? Sir, fetus जब मम्मी के यूट्रस में डेवलप हो रहा है ना, here we have umbilical cord and placenta, and there is a lot of fluid around the baby, which is called as the amniotic fluid. And the baby is nicely rotating in the amniotic fluid. So, but in the 9th month, samjho, the uterus begins to contract and the baby is situated like this. Instead of vertical, it is horizontally attached. ऐसे है baby in the amniotic fluid. Then, on contraction of the uterus, the baby may get crushed. So, sir, how do you prevent crushing of the baby? How do you deliver the baby? Just 15 days before childbirth is given out from the placenta a chemical called, we all have heard of it, prostaglandins. And prostaglandins from the placenta act on the internal os, and internal os dilates. तो वो dilate हो जाता है and forms a perfect concavity. एक concave बन जाता है and head of the baby convex होता है. So the convexity of the head fits into the concavity of the cervix and the baby's head gets locked in the cervix. Cervix में वो lock हो जाता है, अब उसका rotation बंद हो जाता है. And now when the uterus will contract, the baby will be delivered head first, and then his body will come out and nicely parturition will take place without any problem. I hope you've understood this all.